Hello everyone, welcome to the lecture series on machine learning. We already know that in supervised learning, we train a model using labeled data. As you can see in the examples on the screen, when we give data to a supervised learning model, we also provide the correct label or target along with the input, right? So this helps the model learn the relationship between the input and the expected output. There are two major types of problems that we commonly solve using supervised learning is classification and regression. And in today's lecture, we are going to understand both these problems. So let's get started. Let's first start with the classification. So classification basically works like a category sorter. Suppose we have many different objects and we want to put them into different categories based on certain characteristics. For example, suppose we have two classes, animal and object, and we have different items, and our job is to decide which class each item belongs to. So, in simple words, classification means assigning an input to a particular category or class. So, how does the model do this? Actually, it learns from past label examples. For example, if we have already given the model many examples of animals and objects along with their correct labels, the model learns pattern from those examples. So then when we give it a new object, it uses what it has learned to predict which class that new input belongs to. So this is a very basic idea about classification. Let's understand classification with some technical examples. A very common example is email classification. In our email system, we usually have categories such as inbox and spam, right? So during training, we can provide the model with many examples of emails that are already labeled as spam or not spam. So the model learns patterns from these labeled emails, and then when a new email arrives, the model predicts whether it belongs to the spam class or the not spam class. So this is a classification problem because the output is a category. Let's look at the another example. Suppose we want to classify a medical image based on whether a particular tumor is a benign or malignant. So here we have two possible classes, right? So a supervised learning model can be trained using labeled medical image, and then it is used to classify new image into one of these classes. So whenever the output represents a class or a category, we are dealing with a classification problem. And if there are only suppose if there are only two classes like yes, no, spam, not spam, true, false, like that, so that is called binary classification. And suppose if there are more than two classes, for example, risk, it can be high, moderate, or low, so that is a multi-class classification. So these are the examples of classification. Now let's understand what does the model actually do when it performs classification. So when we train a classification model, it learns patterns that help it distinguish between different classes. So in many classification models, we can represent we can represent this separation using something called a decision boundary. So here you can see this is a decision boundary. So think of it as a boundary that separates different regions, right? For region 1 and region 2. If a new data point falls, suppose if a new data point falls on one side of the boundary, the model may classify it as one class, and if it falls on another side, the model may classify it as another class. So the exact shape of the decision boundary depends on the algorithm and the features being used during the training. So for example, decision tree, that's an algorithm, is one of the algorithms that can be used for supervised learning and can be used for classification problem. And the model learns from the labeled training data and uses the learned patterns to classify new data. Let's talk about some important points about classification. So, very first, the output of a classification model is always a class or a label. For example, yes, no, spam, not spam, high, medium, low, or different categories such as animal, fruit, or object, like that. Then classification can be a binary classification when there are two classes, or a multi-class classification when there are more than two classes. Also, we can evaluate the performance of a classification model using different performance matrices. One common metric is accuracy, which tells us how often the model's predictions are correct. And there are several algorithms that can be used for classification, such as logistic regression, support vector machines, decision tree, and random forest. So, that is the basic idea of classification. Let's take a brief summary of classification. Classification is a supervised learning problem in which we have labeled data and the model learns to assign new inputs to different categories or classes. It can be binary classification or multi-class classification. The model learns patterns from the training data, and depending on the algorithm may learn a decision boundary that helps separate different classes. Next, when new data is given, the model uses what it has learned to determine which class the new input belongs to. So, in simple words, classification means sorting or assigning data into categories. So, that's all about classification. Now, let's move to the second major problem in supervised learning, and that is regression. So, what is the difference between classification and regression? In classification, the output belongs to a particular class or a category, while in regression, the model estimates a numerical value. This value can be something like a house price, temperature, salary, sales amount, or any other numerical quantity. So, the main thing to remember about regression is used when we want to estimate or predict a numerical value. Let's understand regression with an example. Suppose we want to predict the price of a house. We may have information such as the size of the house, number of bedrooms, location, age of the house, and many other features. Right? As a human may look at these factors and estimate the possible prices of the house. Right? So a machine learning model can do similar. It learns patterns and relationships from the training data. For example, based on the house size, number of bedrooms, location, and the age, the model may predict that a particular house could have a price of 50 lakhs rupees, right? So that 50 lakh rupees is the predicted numerical value. So this is the regression problem. We can take another example. Let's take an example to predict tomorrow's temperature. So based on the available historical and relevant weather data, a model may predict that tomorrow's temperature could be around 25 degrees Celsius. So here again, the output is a numerical value. So this is also a regression problem. And remember, a prediction is an estimate, right? So it may not always be exactly correct because the actual value can be different. So that is why we call it prediction, right? Either it's a classification or a regression. Ultimately, all machine learning models predict something. Okay, so in regression, we generally estimate and predict a numerical value. Now, how does a regression model actually make this prediction? Let's take the example of a linear regression. Linear regression is actually an algorithm. So, during training, the model looks at the training data points and learns. So, these are the training data points, all this. So during training, the model looks at the training data points and learns the relationship between the input features and the target value. So in simple linear regression, this relationship can be represented using the line. This. The algorithm finds a line that best fits the training data by minimizing the prediction errors, and that this is called a best fit line. Once the model has learned this relationship, we can give it a new point. So here we can see, suppose this is a new point. So the model uses the learned line or relationship to estimate the corresponding numerical value. So the model is not simply looking at the distance of the new data point from the line. Instead, it uses the relationship it learned during the training to make the prediction. And linear regression is one of the algorithms which we use to solve regression problem. There are few important things to remember about regression. That is, first, the output of a typical regression problem is a numerical value, often continuous values. For example, house price, temperature, salary, sales, or other measurable quantities. To evaluate a regression model, we can use different performance metrics. One common metric is mean squared error, that is MSE. MSE measures how different the predicted values are from the actual values by calculating the average of the squared errors. And there are different algorithms and methods that can be used for regression, such as linear regression, polynomial regression, and several other regression algorithms are there. So the main idea is simple. Regression is about estimating a numerical value. Let's finally summarize what we learn in this way. So this is about the regression. Okay, let's finally summarize what we learned in this video. Classification and regression are two major types of problems that can be solved using supervised machine learning, right? We can remember them very simply, like classification, sorting into categories. Classification means sorting into categories, while regression means estimating a numerical value. So in classification, the model learns from label training data and assigns new inputs to different classes. And classification can be binary classification, where there are two classes, or multi-class classification where there are more than two classes. In regression, the model learns patterns and relationships from training data and uses them to estimate a numerical value. For example, it can predict the price of a house, estimate the temperature for a particular day, etc. So, if the answer we are looking for is a category, we are generally dealing with classification. And if the answer we are looking for is a numerical value, we are generally dealing with regression. So, and with this, we have understood the two major supervised learning problems, classification and regression. That's all for today's video. We'll see you in the next lecture. Till then, bye bye. Take care.